Good morning, everyone. It's December 28th, Wednesday, and I'm taking a pause from this happy holiday season to talk, of course, about the latest few drops of the Twitter files. So, the prevailing themes of which are, of course, things like censorship, our US government's own state run propaganda campaign, both domestically and abroad, and the broader theme of what can only be described as propaganda as a result of all of this. So stick with me, please. If you want to, I'm going to get into the latest drop, part 10, which I'm, of course, particularly interested in, being that it relates to the COVID debate and Twitter and via pressure from our US government. What evidence is there around what was going on behind the scenes to censor ordinary Americans as well as doctors and experts in the field? But before I get into that, I think that the previous two drops, so part 9 and part 8, both provide some helpful context before we even get into the COVID files. I probably, like many of you, was just like itching for COVID to finally come up as a topic of conversation. And I'm really happy that parts 1 through 9 were published first, because I think, again, they just provide really important context as to which types of government agencies were meeting with Twitter and other big tech platforms regularly, and what the dynamic looked like as far as their interactions with them around some of these topics that are, as it happens, some of the most important topics to us. So elections, and so our very democracy, the Ukraine war, which is a hot topic these last couple of years, COVID and its origins and vaccines and things like that. So I was really itching for us to finally get to this point where we're only starting to see the tip of the iceberg around COVID and how that narrative has been controlled on Twitter specifically. But of course, we can project that out pretty safely, knowing now as part of these drops that a lot of government agencies and a lot of big tech platforms were part of these regular meetings. A quick recap of what part 8 and part 9 of the Twitter files covered. So part 8 is called How Twitter Quietly Aided the Pentagon's Covert Online PSYOP Campaign. That was a curveball I didn't see coming personally. Li Fang is the independent journalist who published that story, and it's something in the vein of some similar things he's been interested in and reported on in the past. So this drop specifically, go read Twitter Files Part 8. Because spoiler alert, you won't see the story covered on CNN or ABC or NBC or any of the big six controlled media, traditional media companies. I'm really curious to see in the future the details of their own complicity in this overall campaign. But I think that their silence speaks volumes when they do. We'll talk about this later, but when they do talk about it, it is casting a broad brush of, this is disinformation. They won't object to any of the factual, any of the individual facts on their merit, but they will cast with a sweeping brush, doubt over the motivations, or basically casting doubt on why you should take the story seriously at all, or any of these individual stories that the Twitter files are exposing. But part 8, Li Fang talks about how the Department of Defense, so the Pentagon, worked with Twitter to cover their tracks around basically their what can only be described truly as a disinformation, our own state government running a disinformation campaign, both domestically and abroad. Specifically, a lot of fake accounts that they created. We know that they had their hands in Syria, Iran. These were AI generated profile pictures that looked really real. And they were posting, there were a lot of them, y'all, and they were posting content basically controlling the message around US drone attacks, they were intended to spread disinformation abroad, as what can only be described, as Li Fang points out, as a psychological operations campaign by our own US government to control perceptions about US operations abroad. Very interesting. So, one of my key takeaways from that, especially when you overlay it with part 9, which dropped next, and that was called Twitter and Other Government Agencies. I'm using air quotes because other government agencies is known to be a euphemism for the CIA. And there's a lot of evidence in the files that Matt Taibbi released as a part of those drops that things like reports, they looked exactly like CIA briefings. And even though they're referred to as other government agencies on things like agendas for meetings, a lot of ex and current CIA were saying, yeah, it's the CIA. So that drop talked about pressure from other government agencies, so U.S. government agencies and a variety of them, not just the CIA, about, quote, foreign influence. How they were pressuring Twitter essentially to say, like, come up with evidence that these people talking about things that don't fit our narrative, so whether it was about COVID or Ukraine or elections or whatever, you need to come up with some evidence that this is an example of, things like Russian disinformation and things like that. Never giving Twitter and any of these files that we've seen so far, at least, never giving them evidence. It's more of like a profiling job. So they're saying, because these accounts are talking about X, Y, and Z. So because these accounts, for example, are talking about the origins of COVID being from a lab, or because they're talking about the Ukraine war in a way that we don't want them to, or whatever the topic was, that in and of itself, it was almost like McCarthyism, that the accusation itself becomes a substitute for proof. There's never any proof or evidence that these government agencies are giving Twitter. It's just good old-fashioned pressure we need you to find, an example of how these violate your policies because it's foreign influence. Is what it looks like to us. Twitter wasn't fast enough in reviewing these individually because the sheer volume of what was coming in was just overwhelming. It was thousands. These Excel documents filled with hundreds and then sometimes thousands of accounts for Twitter to review, with nothing more than, you need to review these, and because they have the hallmarks of disinformation or foreign influence or what have you. And Twitter not doing that fast enough, and even having internal conversations about Twitter, getting frustrated, high-level executives saying, like, we're losing our window of independence here, which is very telling to me, that Twitter is saying we're losing our window of independence. Basically, we're not coming up with the evidence that they need fast enough. We're not finding any implicating evidence that these are foreign influence, or that this is false information, or that these are violations of our policies. The government's getting mad at us and they're pressuring us. We're losing our window of independence here, meaning, to me, we're going to just have to act on their behest and take care of these accounts without having fully vetted them or found evidence ourselves. That's the implication. So those two drops are, again, just kind of important context around this whole power dynamic between our intelligence agencies, the U.S., the White House, even, as I'm going to get into here in a second. And I mean, White Houses, so we're talking about the Trump White House and the Biden White House. But my key takeaways are, number one, there seems to be this like good old fashioned issue of projection happening. So you know how when we saw in part 8 that our U.S. government via the DoD, the Pentagon, is creating fake accounts on Twitter and to run a disinformation campaign abroad about the U.S. Activities abroad, military activities. Side note, the Pentagon just failed their 5th audit since legislation was passed back in the 90s that required an audit of how our U.S. governments are spending or how our agencies are spending their money. 5 out of 5, the Pentagon has failed. They can't account for how they're spending their money. Anyways, but if you still trust that particular government agency, they're running PSYOP campaigns around the world, our own U.S. government. And when I say an issue of good old-fashioned projection, maybe that's the issue here, when they're then coming back and pressuring Twitter to find evidence of foreign influence on Twitter, doing what they're doing overseas, doing that to us. They're pressuring Twitter. It looks like they might be, guilty of that same thing that happens when, somebody's cheating on their girlfriend, and so then they constantly accuse their girlfriend of cheating on them. They constantly suspect the thing that they're themselves guilty of. Maybe that's it. Maybe the U.S. government is just going, other countries must be doing exactly what we're doing. But the other key takeaway I have is just, I mentioned it before, but in Matt Taibbi's drop in part 9, he talks about, which I think is important, the sheer volume of requests. And when you add on to that the pressure, so them saying, here's a huge volume of accounts we want you to look at, of tweets we want you to look at, of content we want you to look at, and see if it violates your policy because we think this might be foreign influence, because it doesn't fit our, excuse me, our narrative. Excuse me. And then you layer on top of that the pressure that they were exerting in the form of continued, quote, escalations, like, hey, I'm escalating this again. Hey, escalating this again. Hey, what have you done about this? Hey, have you gotten on this yet? So that kind of pressure that Twitter wasn't doing it fast enough ends up becoming, as we see in part 9, this heavy, heavy pressure exerted by our intelligence organization, specifically the CIA, onto Twitter and other tech platforms to, quote unquote, do something about this, as in de-amplify it, give them a strike, suspend them, ban them, do something to combat this information that is inconvenient to our narrative. Mind you, no evidence that they're giving to Twitter in any of these files. It's just, this is a list. This is the list. Like, do something about this. And two, the most prevailing and I think valid objection and kind of reason that people are giving to, almost why you should dismiss all of the Twitter files entirely and just paint with a broad brush that it doesn't matter, is this whole objection that never have we seen in any of these drops, and this is true, a U.S. government agency or a White House or whatever ordering Twitter to censor. They have never, in what we've seen so far, said, you are required, we are ordering you to do something about this and take this down. I think that's kind of a funny objection, and I wonder if those people have read through all of the Twitter files like I and so many others have, because have we learned nothing from, just as one example, the Me Too movement, about just good old-fashioned power dynamics and how that works? Your boss doesn't have to order you to go get them coffee. They can just suggest, hey, it might be a good idea if you go get me some coffee. Hey, it would be really cool if, you would run and get me some coffee. Wouldn't that be nice? Chances are, if that's, your subordinate, you're going to be way less likely to do it than if it's, say, your boss. If you're, let's say, a movie executive and you just suggest, just kind of come on to an actress that you may or may not cast in your big movie, like, is that ordering them to have sexual relations with you, or is that just simply coercion, knowing the underlying power dynamics? It is hilarious to me that that is the main objection, because I'm like, do not know how, what would you do if the Pentagon or the CIA was pressuring you to do something and saying, do something. Have you done something? Have you done something? And then conveniently, if you're taking too long, as we saw in these cases, conveniently, then you see a story in the media that's leaked by the government saying, oh, the government is really, angry that Twitter and other tech agencies aren't doing things fast enough to combat, foreign misinformation. It's very interesting. And now I think that these Twitter files have shown me that we need to clarify when we say disinformation from here on out, which kind we're talking about. Like, are we talking about true disinformation in the meaning like what it meant before our government and big tech and media all worked together to rebrand the term as anything that doesn't fit the narrative? Or are we talking about true disinformation, as is the case with the Pentagon PSYOP campaign, where it's actual fake accounts spreading fake information to control perceptions? So, speaking of the new kind of misinformation, I'm going to read to you some of my favorite tweets. Favorite's a funny word to use here, but by David Zweig's latest installment of the Twitter file. So this is part 10, where we finally get into, titled, How Twitter Rigged the COVID Debate. And he says they did this, one, by censoring information that was true but inconvenient to the COVID debate, to U.S. government policy. Number 2, by discrediting doctors and other experts who disagreed. And number 3, by suppressing ordinary users, including some sharing the CDC's own data. This gets fun, so hang in with me for this. So the United States government, he says, pressured Twitter and other social media platforms to elevate certain content and suppress other content about COVID-19. Internal files at Twitter that I viewed while on assignment for the Free Press showed that both the Trump and Biden administrations directly pressed Twitter executives to moderate the platform's pandemic content according to their wishes. At the onset of the pandemic, according to meeting notes, the Trump administration was especially concerned about panic buying. They came looking for, quote, help from the tech companies to combat misinformation about runs on grocery stores. And then he says, but there were, in fact, runs on grocery stores. So here you have the Trump administration pressuring Twitter to suppress content, essentially, about, like, do something about all these people talking about runs on grocery stores. It's creating panic. And here we see factually there were actually runs on grocery stores in those early days of the pandemic. So one could make the argument here that, oh, the government's just trying to control. The Trump White House at the time was trying to make sure that people weren't freaking out, that there wasn't fear-mongering happening. Some in this country might even stipulate that that would be a noble cause. I stand by my opinion on both sides of this. It doesn't matter which side this is happening or which side agrees with it or can justify the motive, is that if our government is trying to control information, especially when it's true, it doesn't matter what the objective is. It doesn't matter if the cause is noble or nefarious. It's still wrong because it's still our First Amendment. Our First Amendment rights to talk about runs on grocery stores and to panic if we're panicking, to panic openly. That is our right. We have the right to panic, is what I'm saying. But then number 7, it wasn't just Twitter. The meetings, this is where we know, the meetings with the Trump White House were also attended by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and others. So hi, YouTube people. Please don't take this video down. I'm tired of you doing that. When the Biden administration took over, one of their first meeting requests with Twitter executives was on COVID. The focus was on anti-vaxxer accounts, especially Alex Berenson. I've talked about this case before, Alex Berenson, and the files we've already seen that are about to be elaborated on. We've already seen that he sued. He settled with Twitter because files and discovery in that process showed direct pressure from the Biden administration to do something about Alex Berenson, and therefore a violation of his free speech rights, potentially, if this were, to escalate to a First Amendment case. In the summer of 2021, President Biden said social media companies were, quote, killing people for allowing vaccine misinformation. Our president said that. That's correct. Berenson was suspended just hours after Biden's comment, and he was kicked off the platform the following month. Berenson sued, as we know, and then settled with Twitter. In the legal process, Twitter was compelled to release certain internal communications which showed direct White House pressure on the company to take action on Berenson. Berenson, as a quick reminder, was, quote, actioned by Twitter based on information he was posting that was true, has since, it has aged well, it has stood the test of time, it has remained to be true. In a December 2022 summary of meetings with the White House by Lauren Culbertson, Twitter's head of U.S. public policy, adds new evidence of the White House's pressure campaign and cements that it repeatedly attempted to directly influence the platform. So now David Zweig is moving into, we saw this happen with Alex Berenson. We knew at least a little bit about those internal communications between the White House and Twitter. Now we have evidence that this continued, and this is bigger than one account. Culbertson wrote that the Biden team was, quote, very angry that Twitter had not been more aggressive in deplatforming multiple accounts. They wanted Twitter to do more. Still talking about COVID misinformation, quote unquote, the new kind of misinformation. The one where, you question the efficacy and safety of vaccines. The one where you question the origins of COVID itself. That kind. Twitter executives did not fully capitulate to the Biden team's wishes. An extensive review of internal communications at the company revealed employees often debating moderation cases in great detail and with more care than was shown by the government toward free speech. So we see, or David Zweig has seen in these files, evidence that Twitter executives were trying to review these pretty comprehensively and thoroughly internally. But Twitter did suppress views, many from doctors and scientific experts, that conflicted with the official positions of the White House. As a result, legitimate findings and questions that would have expanded the public debate went missing. If you don't think that's a big deal, I don't care which side of COVID or any one of these issues you're on, if you don't think that's a big deal, that an entire side of questions and true facts were suppressed, thereby throwing a giant thumb on the scales of what would have otherwise been public debate around all of these issues. Just went missing. There were 3 serious problems with Twitter's process. First, much of the content moderation was conducted by bots trained on machine learning and AI, impressive in their engineering, yet still too crude for such nuanced work. Second, contractors in places like the Philippines also moderated content. They were given decision trees to aid in the process, but tasking non-experts to adjudicate tweets on complex topics like myocarditis and mask efficacy data was destined for a significant error rate. So you're, hiring people on, Upwork overseas to giving them a decision tree and saying just follow this. You're creating the decision tree, by the way, with your certain end goal in mind. So the Twitter files go on. Third, most importantly, the buck stopped with higher level employees at Twitter who chose the inputs for the bots and decision trees and subjectively decided escalated cases and suspensions. As it is with all people and institutions, there was individual and collective bias. Yes, of course. With COVID, this bias bent heavily toward establishment dogmas. Excuse me. Inevitably, dissident yet legitimate content was labeled as misinformation, and the accounts of doctors and others were suspended both for tweeting opinions and demonstrably true information. What is this, you guys, if not government censorship and propaganda? What is this? Exhibit A, or even if you take the government out of it, what is this? What is this? Exhibit A, Dr. Martin Koldorf, an epidemiologist at Harvard Medical School, I've heard of them before, tweeted views at odds with U.S. public health authorities and the American left, the political affiliation of nearly every entire staff at Twitter. I love how David just casually slips that in as a reminder. Internal emails show a, quote, intent to action by a moderator saying Koldorf's tweet violated the company's COVID-19 misinformation policy, and it claimed he shared, quote, false information. Here's what he said, by the way. This tweet says, by this doctor, no, thinking that everyone must be vaccinated is as scientifically flawed as thinking that nobody should. COVID vaccines are important for older, high-risk people and their caretakers. Those with prior natural infection do not need it, nor children. And then it goes on to say in the Twitter files, but Koldorf's statement was an expert's opinion, one which also happened to be in line with vaccine policies in numerous other countries outside the U.S., yet it was deemed, quote, false information by Twitter moderators merely because it differed from CDC guidelines. After Twitter took action, Koldorf's tweet was slapped with a misleading label, and all replies and likes were shut off, throttling the tweet's ability to be seen and shared by people, the ostensible core function of the platform. In my review of internal files, I found countless instances of tweets labeled as misleading or taken down entirely, sometimes triggering account suspension simply because they veered from CDC guidance or differed from establishment views. A tweet by Kelly KGA, a self-proclaimed public health fact-checker with 18,000 followers, was flagged as misleading and replies and likes disabled, even though it displayed the CDC's own data. So she displays this chart from the CDC, and this is during a time where people were claiming falsely that COVID was a leading cause of death among children. And she says, here's what her tweet says, and she shows the actual chart and the data in its entirety from the CDC's own website and says, what an excellent example of cherry picking. If you narrow it down to only the specific months you specify, which include the largest COVID wave seen across the world, and you ignore all non-disease deaths, and you ignore cancer, heart disease, SIDS, then COVID is, quote, leading. So she's basically calling people out for, you cherry picked, you basically excluded all the other leading causes of death and manipulated this data to look like COVID is a leading cause of death of children. In children, it is absolutely not. By the way, our lovely congressman from California, Ted Lieu, continues to claim that and then delete his own tweets because he's called out nowadays for spreading misinformation. Internal records showed that a bot had flagged the tweet and that it received many, quote, tattles, what the system amusingly called reports from users. So if you report somebody on Twitter, it's called a tattle. That triggered a manual review by a human who, despite the tweet showing actual CDC data, nevertheless labeled it misleading. Telling me the tweet by Kelly KGA that was labeled misleading was a reply to a tweet that contained actual misinformation. Isn't that ironic? COVID has never been the leading cause of death from disease in children, yet the tweet remains on this platform and without a misleading label. So the tweet that was misinformation remained, no misleading label. And then her tweet, which calls it out and says, you manipulated this data, it is not a leading cause of death in children. This is cherry picking data, and then posts the full table, or it replies to that full chart and points out what she's talking about. She's labeled misleading. How interesting. Whether by humans or algorithms, content that was contrarian but true was still subject to getting flagged or suppressed. This tweet was labeled misleading, even though the owner of this account, a physician, was referring to the results of a published study. Here's what she said. Below, the first study I have seen showing that mRNA vaccines in young people aged 16 to 39 are associated with cardiac arrests, not just myocarditis. And then she goes to link to the results of the study. Andrew Bostom, a Rhode Island physician, was permanently suspended from Twitter after receiving multiple strikes for misinformation. One of his strikes was for a tweet referring to the results from a peer-reviewed study on mRNA vaccines. So he says primary COVID-19 mRNA vaccination temporarily impairs semen concentration and total motile count among semen donors with apparent rebound by about 5 months, but no data on boostering effect. Does boostering yield another decline? Okay, this goes on. A review of Twitter log files revealed that an internal audit conducted after Bostom's attorney contacted Twitter found that only one of Bostom's 5 violations were valid. The one Boston tweet found to still be in violation cited data that was legitimate but inconvenient to the public health establishment's narrative about the risks of flu versus COVID in children. And here's his tweet. This is the one that was deemed to be a valid strike. U.S. and local Rhode Island data. Influenza is more lethal than COVID-19 in children, while COVID-19 vaccination causes greater serious morbidity than influenza vaccination in children. So that this tweet was not only flagged by a bot, but its violation manually affirmed by a staff member is telling of both the algorithmic and the human bias at play. Bostom's account was suspended for months and was finally restored on Christmas Day. Another example of human bias run amok was the reaction to this tweet by Trump. Many Trump tweets led to extensive internal debates, and this one was no different. And this is when Trump said, quote, I will be leaving the great Walter Reed Medical Center today at 6:30 p.m. feeling really good. Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago. Congratulations. In a surreal exchange, Jim Baker, at the time Twitter's deputy general counsel, remember he's from the FBI, asks why telling people to not be afraid wasn't a violation of Twitter's COVID-19 misinformation policy. So here's what our friend Jim Baker sent to Yoel Roth and Stacia Cardiel. Yoel and Stacia, why isn't this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID-19 policy, especially the don't be afraid of COVID statement? Yoel Roth, Twitter's former head of trust and safety, had to explain that optimism isn't misinformation. So, yeah, it shows his response there. Remember Kelly KGA with the CDC data tweet? Twitter's response to her is clarifying, quote, we will prioritize review and labeling of content that could lead to increased exposure or transmission. So they justified her saying, no, it's actually not COVID is actually not the leading cause of death in children. They say to her, they justify by saying we will prioritize review and labeling of content that could lead to increased exposure or transmission. Your factual statement is inconvenient. It could make people less afraid. And that's not a good thing when we need everybody to get this vaccine, which, by the way, the CDC still says is safe and effective. Just so you know, that has not changed. Despite all of the information that's come out since they originally said the vaccine is safe and effective, I need everybody to know so that this video stays up on YouTube. The CDC says the COVID-19 vaccine is safe and effective, and everybody should get several. Okay, we're almost done here. Twitter made a decision via the political leanings of senior staff and government pressure that the public health authorities' approach to the pandemic, prioritizing mitigation over other concerns, was the science. Capital T, capital S. That's the science now. Not science in the sense of like actual science. The science seems to have been determined to be prioritizing mitigation of COVID-19 virus over absolutely every other factor, every other concern, at all costs mitigate COVID-19, which has obviously caused many, many problems that are, in many of our opinions, way greater than the threat of COVID-19. And it's still a threat. I'm not saying that. People die from it. I'm not discounting that. Okay. 38, because we're almost done here. I want to barrel through. Information that challenged that view, such as showing harms of vaccines or that anything that could be perceived as downplaying the risk of COVID, especially to children, was subject to moderation and even suppression, no matter whether such views were correct or adopted abroad. Doesn't matter if it's true. Doesn't matter if other countries, like this is based on the response in other countries either. If you say it and you're in the US, it's going to be suppressed because it's inconvenient to the narrative. And then he asks with this question, which I think is really sobering. He says, what might this pandemic and its aftermath have looked like if there had been a more open debate on Twitter and other social media platforms, not to mention the mainstream press, about the origins of COVID, about lockdowns, about the true risks of COVID in kids, and much more? That is a great question, David Zweig. And I'll leave you all with that.